it's a prefab building, but it'll hold 125, and they've got quite a sound system and all the instruments, keyboards and microphones and all this going on. The baptistry is still in the gym. They don't have that set up yet. But let me tell you, second day there must have been 100 guys there. And I think David, like I say, the chaplain there was really good. I think David Roth picked the songs. So the second day the songs were Because He Lives and Oh How I Love Jesus. Now listen, when you get 100 guys singing Oh How I Love Jesus, and it was awesome. Let's say the band is mixed, and they don't exactly sing it like it was written, but it was good. Let me tell you, it was good. There's one guy, kind of a big black guy at the back there, and I think he's actually the choir director. To see him just smiling and rear back, oh, how I love Jesus. It was awesome. It was awesome. Sang Amazing Grace. It was good. And the keyboard player was lining Amazing Grace. And that was unusual. I told him, I says, I've heard of lining a hymn, but I've never seen anybody do it. But he was given the next phrase as we finished each one. He's doing a good job. So it's amazing. A lot of the fellows were saved. I think there were 5 that actually maybe made a profession over the 2 days. And some came forward for prayer and whatnot. I got to preach yesterday. Enjoyed that very much. And worst thing about it, there's a lot of walking involved. But that's just the way it works. All right, let's take our Bibles and go to Genesis. We're going to look at the last patriarch who isn't actually called a patriarch. Why is he not listed as a patriarch? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, the last whole part of Genesis really deals with Joseph, a major character in Genesis. Why isn't he a patriarch? He's one of 12, exactly. Yeah, because when you look at it, Isaac was the only heir, and there was a promise that his seed would be a multitude. Then there was Jacob and Esau. Esau kind of forfeited everything, so there was only Jacob. And but then we have 12. So it is. And so the patriarchs are always listed as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And let's look at Genesis 48 to begin with on this particular question. Because as we followed it down, God gave Abraham his covenant. I'll give you this land. To Isaac, it was confirmed to Isaac, I will give you and your descendants this land. It was confirmed to Jacob, I will give you this land. That is never given to Joseph. But what was given to Joseph in Isaiah 48 down in verse 22, moreover, I've given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. Now, we have no idea what he's talking about there. So no use to speculate on that, but there it is. But he gave Joseph the double portion. He gave him the birthright of the first son. And but not the covenant blessing. It wasn't given to him. In chapter 49, he blesses each of the 12 sons. And so that's the foundation of Israel. So the promise of the nation, you might say the foundation of a multitude, was in this generation, in the 12 sons. And actually 13 if we look, because he counted, that's the double blessing, he counted Manasseh and Ephraim as his sons, bringing them in. Now, back to the faith of the patriarchs. With Abraham, we looked at the growth of faith. With Isaac, the rest of faith. With Jacob, it was the struggle of faith. And in Joseph, we did a study on Joseph. So we'll just briefly go over Joseph, and I called him the patience of faith. Or you might say the endurance of faith. When we see patience in the New Testament, It is the word to bear up under. So that's kind of the idea here, that he had the ability to keep believing and trusting the living God, despite whatever the circumstances were. So let's look back to Genesis 37, come through this a little bit, looking at the endurance of faith, the patience of faith. In chapter 37, verses 5 through 11, his dreams. Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I've dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaf stood around about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. He dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I've dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. Now that's pretty blatant there, the 11 stars, because there were 11 brothers. So they pretty well understood what he was saying. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him. But his father observed the saying. You know, this was a time when God in particular spoke through dreams and visions. And so I think Jacob realized that God was in fact speaking to Joseph. Now, how old was he? He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. So I don't know. He was maybe just the beginning in the teen years when this happened. It's interesting that God was speaking to him that early, but God also spoke to Samuel when he was very young. And so God is speaking to Joseph at a very young age. So,
there again, you see a difference between Jacob and Abraham. Abraham was willing to offer Isaac, his only son, accounting that God was able to raise him from the dead. Jacob, when his other sons came back and told him Joseph was alive, told him not to lie to him, not to bother. He would not believe that Joseph was alive at first, and if he believed God had plans to use Joseph.
yeah, well, that is true. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, believing he was able to raise him from the dead. But with Jacob and the loss of Joseph, it was, and that was after the dreams. You're right, it was after the dreams. Yet we see nothing but mourning. And that's why we look at Jacob as the struggle of faith. That man struggled with faith all his life long. Even though God was working all around him and delivering him, and ever so often, with Lot, if it hadn't been for God, Lot said, if it hadn't been for the Lord your God, I would have dealt with you.
I think Jacob is beginning to realize God's going to do what God said he would do, whether we understand it or not. And I think he's sitting back and he realizes Joseph is now alive, and I think he's understanding. There's a whole lot more going on here than I understand, but I'm going to sit back and watch.
Anyway, I think it was reasonable. When you consider Jacob and his sons, it was reasonable that God would speak to Joseph, just because of his character. And so that was another thing that it's interesting that Jacob observed this dream, that God is doing something here in his life. So anyway, chapter 42, verse 21. Joseph is 17 years old, and this betrayal by his brethren is traumatic. In chapter 42, verse 21, his brothers, not understanding that they're standing before Joseph and that he is understanding their language, says this, and they said one to another, We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon him. That separation was not an easy thing. It wasn't that Joseph said, oh, this must be God's will. We understand from other scriptures that there was strong crying and begging on his part as he was sold there. But I kind of wonder, as Joseph was carried into Egypt, did he know Genesis 15? Where God told Abraham, your children are going to be carried to a foreign land, and they're going to be servants there. And 400 years later, they're going to come out. 4 generations later, they're going to come out. And maybe there's some controversy as to how this history came down.
I would say he did, unless he was informed of it later, because in Hebrews 11 it said he gave commandment concerning his bones.
Yeah.
And so he knew they were going to come out of Egypt.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, Andrew, is that, yes, he did know. The big thing is, the common idea is that this history was oral tradition for a while before it was written down, as though they couldn't write. I tend to believe that it was written. I don't think they were that ignorant. I think they wrote. Maybe not, but at any rate, it was passed down. And so I definitely believe that Joseph knew that prophecy that was given to Abraham, that they would go to a foreign country, and that it would be generations before they came out. I don't think he comprehended that when he was sold. But I wonder if he did not meditate on that as time went on when he was there in Egypt. Revelation is cumulative. Isn't that true? I mean, the Bible, we get more and more as time goes on until we have it completed. And as we study it, learning the first part of the Bible is the foundation to understanding the latter part of the Bible. And so I feel like Joseph did, in fact, comprehend that. Let's look at Genesis 39, verse 2. Very simple verse. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. The Lord was with Joseph. The idea is that the Lord was near him, that he was by him. There's the essential presence of God. That's his omnipresence. He's everywhere, all the time, beholding the good and the evil. He is as much in a restaurant down the street as he is here, as far as his essential essence goes. There is the manifest presence of God. Jacob experienced it when he wrestled with him. Abraham experienced it when the Lord and the angels came. He experienced it in Genesis 15. So there's that manifest presence of God. We're never told that Joseph experienced the manifest presence of God. But there's a third presence of God, which is a cultivated personal presence of God, basically a witness of the Holy Spirit in the heart. And it may be very close to being able to say that Joseph walked with the Lord, to use that pre-flood term, that there was a definite fellowship that Joseph had with the Lord that resulted in wisdom, that resulted in character, that resulted in wise decisions, that resulted in prosperity, and that resulted in a witness. It says his master knew that the Lord was with him. And that's an interesting thing, because he recognized and he knew the source of Joseph's success, which was the Lord. That's a good testimony that he had there. Then we have the incident with Potiphar's wife. And his master turns on him and commits him to the dungeon. So down in verse 31 of that chapter, 39, 21. But once again, in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. You know, the Lord was with him in prison. I met a couple who said, you know, I asked them, where'd you find the Lord? Where did the Lord find you? And the answer was in prison. And you find them, they're doing the correspondence. There was one guy in lockup. He was on like lesson 31 of a 2-year program with Rock of Ages, a correspondence course. They have discipleship courses. They have mentoring courses. We met a guy, I forgot which church he was from, but he's in the prison mentoring prisoners. When we went in Tuesday morning, they had a Bible study going. We were talking about Job and his trials. Out on the, in the dorms, they have the wings off each side. You come in and the officers have an office, and each door is locked. They have to unlock the doors to let you into it. And if I were going to do rental houses, I would do it like a prison. I would do concrete and steel. There's not much you can destroy in there, but that's called the rock. That's the central part there, and it's 2 levels around it with cells on each one. Usually there's 2 to a cell, and so they're out on the rock. So benches out there. So went over, and there was a guy sitting there, and he had his Bible open. He was reading his Bible. Had quite a discussion with him. He's a believer, and he knows his Bible. He's reading it. Makes you wonder, how much do we read our Bible? They read their Bible. But they would say that the Lord was with them in prison. And that was Joseph's testimony. The Lord was with him even in prison. The Lord didn't abandon Joseph. The Lord was with him. You know, 2 Chronicles 15:2. Let's just look over there. 2 Chronicles 15:2. There's a promise. Azariah, the prophet, he goes out to meet Asa. And verse 2, 2 Chronicles 15:2. And he went out to meet Asa and said unto him, Hear ye me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you. Here's the interesting part. While ye be with him. So that tells you something about Joseph. Even in prison, Joseph made a choice that he was going to continue to serve God. And the verse goes on. It says, If ye seek him, he will be found of you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. So Joseph continued that relationship with God. We don't find bitterness. We don't find fear. We don't find sulking. Instead, we find that even in prison, he gets busy to do what he can do. And so he serves. And that leads to promotion. That's true in our prisons. You can be promoted. The chaplain has clerks. They're the inmates who've shown good character.
Just thinking over this whole thing, what did that actually look like to the keeper of the guard? What is he seeing? I think he's seeing a great contentment in Joseph's heart. There's no turmoil. There's no chafing under the confinement. There's a contentment that mankind can't produce.
No, yes, that's true. I think that's exactly it. And that's what I say. There was no bitterness, fear, or sulking. Yes, sir.
I tend to think that, as Andy said, he came to a place where he realized fully that whatever happened, God was in it. God was with him because his heart was right with God. And he was seeking God. Whereas you have somebody like Jacob, who is known to be the supplanter. The supplanter is always the conniver. And the person who's doing it themselves doesn't trust the Lord to do it for them.
Yeah, very true. So, in Joseph, we see a patience of faith that rests in fellowship and trust. There's a patience here, and in his faith. he had the dreams. And we haven't, there's been no other mention of dreams other than the two that he had before he was sold into slavery. That doesn't mean he didn't have dreams. They're just not recorded. Obviously, God was with him. In chapter 40, verse 8, we have the butler and the baker, the cupbearer and the baker, under Pharaoh's disfavor, cast into prison, and they dream a dream. Verse 8 says, they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there's no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And you know the story. They told their dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. Verse 13 down there is a confidence there. Joseph knows when God is speaking to him. That's important. Do you know when God is speaking to you? Because 13, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But notice verse 14. Joseph's completely confident that this is what God is going to do. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. He's not guessing at the interpretation at all. He is sure of it. And that's the basis of that request. Remember me when you stand before Pharaoh. I've considered and thought that the butler failed to do so. He didn't do so immediately. It's not like he's the king's counselor. He's his poison detector. So I don't know. Courts are funny things. So did he have opportunity? So Scripture is interesting. It says 2 full years passed. 2 full years. No mention of Joseph. He was in prison. And then Pharaoh dreams a dream, and nobody can interpret it. And at that moment, the butler remembers. So he didn't forget. It just took him a while to speak up. And when he spoke up, it was the opportune moment. And so, chapter 41, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, chained his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And you know how the story went. Suddenly, hastily, Joseph was brought to Pharaoh. I think that's a key to patience. Things always change. And one of the great challenges to our faith is that we think it will never be any different. And we get really discouraged. And that's when we kind of say, well, Lord, where are you? And, we don't see that in Joseph. But then suddenly, he's in prison one day, no forewarning whatsoever. Messenger from Pharaoh, bring that Hebrew out. You can't appear before Pharaoh like that. Shave, change your clothes. Here we go, zoom. And he's standing before Pharaoh. And what is it? Suddenly. That is so true in Scripture. So often God acts suddenly with no warning of it. But when Joseph comes in and interprets the dream, once again, he's humbly confident in God. Chapter 41, verse 16 says, And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. That's an amazing thing about Joseph. He never takes credit for it. He says, it's God. God will give you an answer, Pharaoh. And down in verse 38, after he interprets the dream, he is confident and he is bold. He says, this is what's going to happen. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, horrible famine. And he goes on to say, Pharaoh, you ought to find somebody really wise, and you ought to store up stuff in the good years for the bad years. And he said that would be a really good plan, because this is going to happen. Verse 38, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? So once again, his character and his faith, his confidence, his boldness, his humility is a witness to the living God. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house according unto thy word. Shall all my people be ruled? Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. Boy, what a change. What a change. Suddenly, he's the ruler of Egypt, the steward of Egypt, as it were, with nobody above him but Pharaoh. And then in chapter 42, verses 6 and 7, and Joseph was governor over all the land, and he it was that sold all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange to them and spake roughly unto them. And so it went. Suddenly, a dream that he'd had decades earlier. Suddenly, the dream happens right before his eyes. The patience of faith. He sees God's word fulfilled before his eyes. But it took decades. It's interesting how God answers prayer. Sometimes he answers immediately. Other times he doesn't. You've heard stories of people who have prayed. I think there's a story of Andrew Murray prayed for one particular individual. That individual wasn't saved until Andrew Murray passed away, I think, right? But he was saved in answer to Andrew Murray's prayers. If you've seen the movie Sheffy, remember the woman with the red rose that she always gave him? But she threw the white rose in on his coffin of conversion that she surrendered to the Lord. Sheffy was praying for her. We don't know when God will answer his prayers or bring to pass what he has promised. We're involved in it right now. The end is coming at some point. We know the Lord is going to return. It will probably be suddenly. Suddenly. Matter of fact, the rapture is going to be suddenly. Unexpected. Everybody going about their regular days. One woman grinding at a well, another drawing water. Suddenly. Do you suppose that Joseph prayed for his brothers?
I think when it says there that he remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them and then accuses them of being spies, he remembered well. They've been on his mind the whole time, and now he's putting them to the test to find out where they are.
Yes, he didn't know them. Yeah, that's right. He hadn't seen them for decades. So, but I have a suspicion he prayed for his family. I would think he did, wouldn't you? And, patience is not forcing a change on his brothers. He could have confronted them right there, but he didn't. What he does is he allows God to work in their minds and their hearts, and that's what Preston's talking about. He kind of put them to the test. Down in 42 verses 21 and 22, and they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, spake I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child? And you would not hear. Therefore, behold, also his blood is required. So suddenly, they are convicted of their sin and their guilt by their own conscience. You know, Joseph could have come, he could have said, do you know who I am? Do you know what you've done to me? Would they have been convicted? Now, you see, conviction, we have to be careful how we force salvation. You can't force salvation upon someone. It's got to come from their own understanding, from their own heart. In other words, they've got to realize that they are a sinner and they need to be saved. And so he didn't force them as far as that goes. So finally, let's go over to chapter 50. We're running a little long.
While you're going there, I want to say too, I wonder how they felt later when they realized that he understood from the beginning every word they said, because they said that in front of him.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Suddenly, yeah, everything was known. They knew everything was known. So the patience, actually I didn't look at the verb. It's right here. Chapter 50, verse 18. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God. You know, sometimes we want to play God. And how we deal with people. Joseph didn't do that. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. You know, it takes patience to see God's purpose finally work out. And Joseph says, you know, God was really in control of this all the time. It wasn't easy. It was heart-wrenching, but God had a plan in it. And it's God. And he says, Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. So, if we look down at the very last here, Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Ah, yes. He says, I have confidence in God's promise to our forefathers. This is the fulfillment of what he said to Abraham. One day God is going to take you out of this land and take you back, and he's going to give you Canaan as he promised. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So here, Joseph's faith rises above time as he confidently predicts the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. And he wasn't going to see it. You know, that's what Hebrews said. They believed the promise, but they didn't receive it. But they had confidence in it. And that was the faith that was pleasing to God. Do you know, you may pray prayers that you never see answered. But don't lose your confidence in God. Don't lose your confidence in God. We have to remember that God sees a much bigger picture than we do. He sees every heart. He sees every circumstance of every person. And it would take infinite wisdom to put all that together and to make a right decision. Not only that, but he knows the past that they've come through. He knows what they're dealing with today, and he knows what the future is. So, you know, the verse that we all love as Christians, all things work together for good to them who love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. That all things working together includes every heart and every circumstance surrounding us that we can't even see or know. And it includes a future that we cannot predict. So that verse about all things includes a whole lot more than just us.
Two things real quick. I think when Joseph was first confronted with his brethren, I don't think he saw any humility in them. And I think that's what he was looking for, was some kind of humility. Joseph spent like 93 years in Egypt. 13 of those were in prison, and then 80 years of honor after that.
Yeah. A little disproportionate, wasn't it? Yes. So, the lesson from Joseph, I guess. Faith trusts the Lord and cultivates that personal relationship. And it leaves the answers to prayers and promises to Him. We go to the New Testament, the centurion that had the sick servant that sent to Jesus to come heal his servant. And there was a humility in that centurion. He realized Jesus was a Jew, and Jews didn't go into Gentiles' houses. So he said, no, you don't need to come. Just speak the word, and it'll be done. And Jesus commended his faith. He says, I haven't found that kind of faith in Israel. That faith in the word of God, his simple word. So Joseph, he's quite an example of the patience of faith and the right attitude when it seems like everything is going wrong in your life. That no matter how hard you try, somehow it doesn't work out.
I see in Joseph, from as long as I can remember, Sunday school stories, he was obviously one of them. And you have Daniel and the lion's den, David and Goliath, all the others. And you're tempted at a young age to look at it and say everything worked out rosy and wonderful at the end.
Yeah.
And in a sense it did, but think of how many people don't want to go to the mission field that God has called them to. They're free to go, free to move around of their own will, all those things. And the difference there where Joseph was taken prisoner, so it wasn't even his choice.
Yeah.
And then when he was honored, he wasn't really free. He couldn't leave Egypt. He had to ask Pharaoh permission to go bury his father. He wasn't really a free man. He was a powerful man. But the difference is God was his anchor. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a culture. Right? Culturally, he had changed.
Yeah.
He married an Egyptian woman. He was different from his brothers. He dressed differently. He spoke Egyptian. He had changed culturally, but God was his anchor, and he was fine with the life that he was content,
Yeah.
happy in the life God had given him. And there's someone else in Scripture I see that almost mirrors that exactly, and that's Daniel.
You
He was
ever
taken prisoner.
You ever have the desire to form a Christian community and build a wall and just everybody go there and hopefully live together happily? It's been tried and it doesn't usually work. No.
Well, that's a challenge to me because I know I tend to find culture, place, things like that. I tend to find security in that.
Yes.
Too much, that tends to be my anchor.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave a certain place, things like that. But like I said, you see that in Daniel too, where he was happy, he was fulfilled, and he lived a life that you don't see a lot of personal choice in.
Well, if you stop and you think about it, who is really free?
Free in spirit.
We get to make choices. I was reading. It's 8 o'clock. A film. I recommend Redeem TV. There's a film on there. Very good film. He's actually a Southern Baptist missionary. He went to Somalia, but then they commissioned him to go to persecuted regions and talk to the people who had been persecuted. Well, how did they maintain their faith? And the interesting conclusion, I think it was in China. This is in the 90s, so China was very locked down, and he met with it was over 100 house church pastors in a very remote area, very secret meeting. And they asked him, has the gospel gone to any other country besides China? They didn't know. And he told them some of the stories of the other nations, and they were so happy that that the gospel was in other parts of the world. But it was interesting. I think it was the Chinese who said, "You're always free to witness." And that's convicting. He says, "You're always." And in China, if you witnessed, you went to prison. They said that was their seminary. And they didn't really trust you until you spent time in prison. And they said, you know, there was all these laws and regulations and restrictions. They said, you're always free to witness, no matter where you are. So, one other story, maybe it'll whet your appetite. One guy, a pastor in Russia before the 90s, arrested for being a Christian, put into a prison, the only Christian, 1,500 prisoners here. And it was wild. It reminded me of the lockup in McCormick. I mean, it is noisy, shouting, cursing back and forth. It's just amazing. They drag him in and they beat him and put him in a cell. And he would, every morning, he would stand at the door of his cell facing the rising sun and said he would sing his heart song to Jesus. Every single morning. Whenever he found a scrap of paper or anything to write with, he would write any Bible verse he could remember, any song, and he'd stick it on the concrete wall. When the guards would find it, they would beat him. And he was there for, I think, 15 years, maybe 17 years. And so finally they decided they would break him. So they took a woman, I guess they got clothes from his wife, and she was of similar build, similar hair, and they drag her in front of his cell down to a torture room. He didn't see her face. They told him it was his wife, and they took her and they tortured her and abused her for 2 years before she died, or 2 days before she died. They drag her body out wrapped in a blanket, and he said, "I'll sign anything." It just tore him up. "I'll sign anything." The next day they came in with the confession that he was an agent of the foreign government and that he denied Christ and all this. And he said, "Last night, the Holy Spirit revealed to me that my wife and my children are alive. Get out of my cell. I'm not signing anything." And a little later, sometime later, he found a whole sheet of paper and a pencil on the yard. So he grabbed that up, tucked it in, and boy, he writes every Bible verse he can remember down on it and sticks it on the concrete post. The guards find it, and they begin beating him, and they drag him up and point to the yard. There's a post out there with ropes and says, "We're going to drag you out there and beat you to death. You're going to be dead in 15 minutes. They drag him out of the cell and start to drag him down. 1,500 prisoners stand at their gate and sing his heart song to God. The guards just stop and they look at him and say, "Who are you?" Put him back in a cell. I think 2 years later he was released and restored to his family. But you can always witness. It may cost you. It may cost me. But you can always witness. All right. Good night to those. Let's see. Anything I need to say tonight? We miss Brother Ray. His kids are sick again and he was feeling dizzy. He doesn't need to be driving mountain roads. So we need to pray for him. Sister Linda